Hi, everyone. I'm Judy the YouTube Lawyer here from North Carolina, and today our special guest is attorney Cyril Yu, who is a good friend of mine from college days. We both went to UC Berkeley together. We actually started at the same law school at Hastings College of Law in San Francisco. So Mr. Yu, also known as Cyril, has been very active in different community organizations. He started out working for a couple of different law firms in California before starting his career with the Orange County District Attorney's Office. So today he's going to share with us some of his experiences being a prosecutor. So let me add him in. Thank you guys for being here. Hi, Cyril.
Hey, Judy. Great to see you.
Okay, great. I'm glad we got the audio working then. So we at least have a few viewers that just tuned in since we just started. So would you like to tell us a little bit about your family background first?
Sure. I'm the son of immigrants that came over from Hong Kong in the late 60s, early 70s. And so my sisters and I, we grew up in the Bay Area. And went to school in Northern California, then in Southern California for high school, and then back up north for college with you at UC Berkeley, and then across the bay to UC Hastings, which is where I got my law degree. And then I started practicing in the state of California.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so how did you decide to go to Hastings for law school?
Well, they let me, just, obviously a starting point. But I had spent a fair amount of time in the Bay Area, really considered that home, both from growing up and also going to college there. And so I felt like I wanted to stay in the Bay Area for one of the law schools that was up there. And that was one of the schools I went to. And it was, it's a standalone law school that's within the UC, the University of California system. So within the UC system, there's a medical school, and there's a law school, and that's the law school that exists, and it's been around for 100 plus years. And it's in the city of San Francisco, which makes it great from that standpoint. A lot of access to a lot of different things, a lot of experiences. And so it was a great place to go to law school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you recall how much tuition was back then? You were an in-stater, right?
I was in-state. I don't know how much it was, but I can tell you, it's funny because at the time, one of the things that we were doing was we were fighting the tuition hikes that were happening across the UC system because of budget. And what they were at the time was they were increasing the professional fees. That is the fees for the people that were going to law school and for medical school, because the attitude of the legislature and the UC Board of Regents was, well, these folks are going to graduate, make a lot of money, and therefore we're not going to have any problems paying back their loans. But that just was simply an excuse to just continue to increase tuition. And one of my classmates actually became at UC Hastings. And a couple of years ago, when we had our reunion, she was explaining to us how expensive tuition was. And we were just floored. I mean, compared to what we were paying, that was a pittance compared to what, unfortunately, kids have to pay these days to get a law degree. And that's really unfortunate because it really is a barrier for a lot of people to get into the law. And it's really unfortunate that you're forcing people who want to be more proactive and interested in the public interest space and go back and serve their communities or take on a government job, that when you carry that coming out, there's a reluctance to take some of those things because of having to address those things. And that's an unfortunate reality that we see not only in California, but for some reason, there you go.
Yeah, it looks like you kind of froze up a little bit there, but I could pretty much hear everything you said. Yeah, I mean, I seem to recall that when we started there at Hastings, the tuition was probably even less than $10,000 a year. Maybe it was only like $8,000 a year, $9,000 a year, something like that.
I don't know if it was that low, but I do remember that it was starting to the teens and perhaps the low 20s, and that's when people were really starting to freak out in terms of what they were anticipating it was going to cost. When you're thinking about being in a city like San Francisco and how expensive it is, and to be clear, right now it's ridiculously expensive to live in the city. But back during that time, it was still very difficult. You'd still have 3-4 students that were, trying to find housing together in order to meet, and a lot of people living outside the city in order to be able to afford living in the Bay Area and be able to go onto campus.
Yeah, I think now Hastings costs at least $44,000 a year just for tuition.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And that's exactly, and that's the type of stuff that my friend, the professor, was talking about in terms of our concerns about that and how it's become, I mean, was a state institution. I mean, the design was going to educate them work in all government and municipalities and in public interest and in corporate and all the rest of it. But when you basically put hurdles like that in front of people and they're walking out of law school, $100,000, you really foreclose a lot of those opportunities for folks and make it that much harder to have a diverse and equitable legal community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Am I freezing up still?
Yeah, a little bit. But can you tell us a little bit about your law school experience? Were you satisfied with being a student at Hastings, or did it meet your expectations?
I don't know if I knew what exactly to expect from law school. I had known for many years that I wanted to go into the practice of law, but I didn't know what the law school experience was going to be until I was there. And I did have a really great experience. One of the things that I loved the most is, out of my entire educational career, it was the one place that I found was the most intellectually stimulating. We had the most interesting debates in every class that I was in. The professors were always incredibly engaging. My classmates were amazing. They came from all walks of life, had all different ideas as to what they wanted to do from a career standpoint. And the other thing was, I had a lot of opportunities to participate in student government. I was involved in student newspaper. I was all involved in both the American Bar Association on the law student division. So I used to travel around the country and meet other law students. And just the experiences during my internship, during my time at Hastings, my first summer, I worked in the Legal Resource Center, which was an advocacy organization focused on immigrant rights. And during my second summer, I had an opportunity to serve as an intern within the Nevada Supreme Court. And so having an opportunity to work in a really cool environment that was very, very different than what I was used to, in a very beautiful location, because Carson City, Nevada is very close to Lake Tahoe, and kind of get that experience as well. It was just a lot of fun during that time period to have. I mean, so for law school, it was a great experience because of what I was learning. The student had a huge impact on what was happening in my life during that time period, and just all of the variety of experiences I had. Just being in and around that environment and participating in student life and all that law school had to offer.
Okay, so what happened after you graduated? Did you immediately start working for a law firm in the Bay Area?
I did not. During that time period, the job market was really tight in the Bay Area, which has always been a problem compared to some other parts of the state. And certainly, one of the things that I thought about was working in the DA's office, but just because of budget issues during that time period as well, a lot of DA's offices weren't hiring because they didn't really have the do that. So I ended up working for a small law firm in Fresno for 2 years, and that was a great experience to kind of try and people in your audience know Fresno is in the Central Valley, so it's the agricultural part of the state. It's far more conservative. Just a really nice farming community that you would find anywhere, in the Midwest or something like that. So it had a very small town feel for it, even though it was a very large city. And the people were very open, welcoming, and inviting. And I learned a lot in that experience. First couple of cases I worked on were agricultural, agribusiness type of cases. And it really gave me insight in terms of how that whole industry works and all of the different aspects and components of that. So it was a great learning experience for me as a Californian who'd been a coastal kid who'd grown up in metropolitan areas. It was nice to get that experience. But after 2 years and getting engaged, I made the move to Los Angeles because my bride-to-be was from Southern California. And so I moved to LA and worked for a firm for 2 years and really enjoyed that experience as well. A very different take on the practice of law, just kind of a crazy group of people that were a lot of fun to work for. And to give you an idea of how kind of interesting they were, one of the requirements to become partner was to jump out of a plane. And so they would take the prospective partner step and you would jump out of a plane. And that was like part of the initiation process. And so it kind of gave you an idea of the types of folks that they had in that particular place. But it was really an interesting way of also figuring out work-life balance. That was something that they actually talked a lot about as a firm. That was incredibly important as time kind of went on. Worked there for 2 years and really wanted to get into a trial court, which was kind of when I first started the journey into becoming a lawyer. I always thought, like, I want to be a trial lawyer. I want to be in court and do stuff. And for the folks that do civil, that's not necessarily something you really get a chance to do that a lot. So I had the opportunity to apply for the Orange County DA's office and into that work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So see, this is where one of our viewers asked what you were kind of starting to talk about, like what motivated you to go into criminal law, because it sounds like you worked for a pretty cool law firm. That does sound like an unusual kind of law firm in Los Angeles that you happened to work for a couple of years.
Yeah,
so,
I had some experiences when I was in law school, volunteering at different offices, San Francisco DA's office, Marin County DA's office. And so I had an idea as to what that type of work was like. And the guy that I worked for in Fresno actually was a former prosecutor, and he'd actually said, you do want to get into prosecution. He kind of talked to me about why the prosecution side was a good side to be on, kind of explaining that aspect of it. I mean, I had a little bit of it from my law school days, but one of the things that kind of I held back in terms of becoming a prosecutor was it felt like the people that were going in that direction, classmates of mine, were very, very passionate about prosecution. And for me, I was more middle of the road. I was the type of person who would look at a case and see both sides of it. The things that I've learned over my career is actually the attorneys that do this are actually the defense attorneys and the prosecutors that really can see both sides of an issue, that can really take apart things and understand kind of what the different nuances to a case are. And so that was something I really started to enjoy, because part of it was that itch to want to become a good trial lawyer. I want to get these trial skills. I want to have that experience in front of a jury. And what was, after you get into it, it's kind of hard to get prosecution out of your system. I started off in the juvenile court system, which within the juvenile court system, it's very different, I would say, than the regular criminal justice system, in that really the focus is towards I would say rehabilitation, but it's really more than that. It's more about figuring out what resources need to be devoted for a particular minor to get them out of the system and to ensure that they don't come back into the criminal justice system. It's much more of a supportive, and certainly in the past 10, 15, 20 years, there's been more resources thrown in that direction to create an environment. So a lot of the work we're doing is really geared towards, yes, we're at the same time pursuing justice, but justice, broadly speaking, is to accomplish a lot of things, not only for the victims in a particular case, but also examining a defendant's life and trying to figure out what works best for them. When you move into more the adult arena, it really kind of depends on the types of cases you're working on. And as I've risen within the office, and I've been doing this work for 19 years, the severity of the cases you're dealing with, the seriousness of the crimes, how complex things get, that really for me has continued to be just a really fulfilling experience, not only dealing with victims and working, helping them through the process, but also challenging myself intellectually to, how do you present cases to the public? How do you use them? And what we see, obviously, because jurors are not in this, they see the news, they react to what's happening in their society. And as prosecutors, part of our responsibility is to say, hey, why is this still relevant? Why is this particular crime still relevant? Why should someone be punished? What should that look like? And really trying to pursue justice, not only for victims, but for society as a whole, and also educate people, as they kind of progress through the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can we backpedal a little bit, and maybe you can tell the would-be law students or law students out there watching, like, how did you even get the job? How tough was it to get the job? Did you have to go through a ton of interviews, and what was the process?
It's harder now than it was then, just because they put on layers and layers and layers to what people need to do in the process. But basically, most DA's offices, for I suppose the larger scale ones, they have routine times during the year where they hire attorneys. And so for us, there's a cycle that happens, and usually happens twice a year. And so it's a public notice that goes out. And these days with the internet, it's a lot easier to find. Back 20 some odd years ago, in the infancy of the internet, it was a lot harder to find some of these job opportunities. But and basically you apply, and you put out all that experience, and then you go on, and it's oftentimes a multi-level type of, and normally within that interview environment, what they're asking you to do is demonstrate some of those abilities and skills. And so what they'll ask you to do is, here is hypothetical, you get to study for a little bit, and then you're put in front of either 3 or 5 seasoned prosecutors, and they're going to put you through your paces of either giving an opening statement or do some type of examination or something like of that nature to basically kind of see where you're at. And one of the people that were hiring many years later, told me that what they're looking for is, how does this person present, right? We can teach you a lot of the skills, but how does this person present? Because ultimately what you are is you're a representative of the state of California. You're the representative of whatever jurisdiction that you're at. And is that just the type of person that we want in front of a jury, trying to tell our community and our peers why justice should be, what we're seeking for in this particular case. And what's nice about California is we have a tremendous diversity. Even though within the prosecutor's offices, it could be more diverse, the reality of it is we still have very, very diverse people that are part of our offices. And I'll tell you about 2 people really quickly. One is a guy who's Middle Eastern. He came over to the country, spoke very, very broken English, but wanted to be a prosecutor, eventually became a prosecutor in our office, was one of the most decorated homicide prosecutors in our office. And you look at this guy, you listen to him, he's like, he still speaks with a really heavy accent. But the reality of it is persuasive, very forceful in his arguments, and incredibly passionate. And the other component of it is because of his upbringing and the challenges he had as an immigrant working his way, he had an appreciation for different communities and what justice really looked like, and really was passionate about that component of it. And the other example that I'll give is someone that I find is amazing, just because I know what I do and how hard it is. But this is actually my best friend in the office, and she is deaf and lost her hearing when she was going through law school. If you can think about how hard law school was, but also be losing your hearing during that time period, and then eventually becomes a problem where your job is to be in court every day and to be able to sense and understand everything that's around you on an interpreter, while also juggling a million things at once, and how hard that job is. And the fact is that, she's, again, one of the best homicide prosecutors we have in our office. She's an amazing, incredibly accomplished woman who's had a lot of difficulties in her life growing up. But to give you an idea of just a broad range that can do this job and do it effectively and have tremendous amount of respect of our colleagues within the office, also from bench officers and from the defense side as well.
Wow, that's really amazing that someone can be a prosecutor yet have a hearing problem. Yeah. Maybe you can answer some of the questions here. What are the responsibilities or what's your day-to-day life like as a prosecutor? And what keeps you up at night?
Keeps me up at night. Oh boy. Let me do the day-to-day responsibility. So it really kind of varies within the office in terms of what your assignment is. And so we have misdemeanor deputies whose responsibilities are to file cases, to negotiate dispositions in cases, to try cases, to handle motions. Our felony deputies also, handling general felonies, have a wide range of those responsibilities as well, but they're doing preliminary hearings as well. And as you rise within the office, they get assigned to a vertical unit. So I've had the opportunity to work in several different vertical units, including what we call FAMACTION, which is our domestic violence unit, which also handles our physical child abuse as opposed to sexual child abuse, but physical child abuse. So, when small children are abused by that type of stuff in terms of physical violence imposed on them, those are the types of cases we would handle there as well. I've been on our gang unit for about 9 years now. And so on a daily basis, I'm reviewing search warrants, new filings, arrests of gang members, and different types of cases relating to that. Today is polishing up or finishing off a homicide filing involving a couple different defendants that were involved in the murder of another gang member. And so those are some of the things that we kind of do on a day-to-day responsibility. You're constantly appearing in court, getting ready for hearings, getting ready for trial, reviewing discovery, turning over discovery, that types of stuff. In terms of what keeps me up at night, I would say I don't really have a lot to keep me up at night anymore. I think when you get to about 19 years in, there's not a whole lot that bugs you. I would say that the things that keep my brain constantly turning is in trial, because you're constantly thinking about what's happening, what happened in the day that you were just in, and then what's happening the next day. And for me, I run trial scripts through my head. I'm trying to organize the closing argument, because you may start off with an idea what your closing argument is going to look like, And during the course of the trial, things have changed. And now you're going like, oh, wait, this is really helpful. Let me see if I can focus on this because this has now become very, very important. And sometimes those things kind of evolve. And as you get towards the end, you're kind of, trying to put together that story. So when you tell it to the jury at the end, it makes sense. And so those are some of the challenges that are there. For me, like I kind of said, there's just that experience level allows me to, the things that used to bother me when I was a younger attorney don't bother me as much anymore. You get kind of old and crotchety and just don't care anymore. But there are still things that make the job challenging that you're like, I don't want to screw this up. I don't want to look like I don't know what I'm doing. Oh my gosh, if I screw this up, they're gonna take me out of this assignment. Kind of that imposter syndrome that stuff is still there.
Okay. Well, we have two questions that are kind of similar from two of our viewers. So Christy asks, how does the process work on deciding if you will prosecute someone? And Tony also asks, what's the usual path of a criminal prosecution? Are you communicating with the defendant's team at any time? So
let me kind of walk through what happens in regular prosecution process for us. And it's different for misdemeanors and felonies slightly, with the big difference between the two in that there's a preliminary hearing, whereas for misdemeanors there isn't. But basically what happens is our police agency partners, they'll get to us police reports. It's usually submitted to us electronically. We have a way that our systems talk to each other. And we review the police reports and we see, is there evidence of a crime? And what's that crime appropriately charged? Is there sufficient evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? So our standard for filing is different than, let's say, the standard for arrest, which is probable cause, right? So it's you got to look at it from that standpoint of, do I have enough to prove the case? The other thing we look at sometimes is this a filing that makes sense in the interest of justice? Because there's oftentimes circumstances where you look at a case and say, yeah, absolutely, this person should be prosecuted. There's a crime that's been committed and this person's responsible for it. But then when you consider the extraneous circumstances outside of it, it may not necessarily be a case that is appropriate and you can reject it in the interest of justice. The other thing is also to think about within the criminal justice system, just because you prosecute a case, you're not guaranteeing what the end result will be, because oftentimes there's different things that happen. We have exist for all kinds of different crimes. There's a lot of different courts that exist, whether it's homeless court, drug court, things like that are structured in a way to get people through what exactly they're dealing with. And we're putting a lot of resources and supports around that. And so in terms of the process itself, so you get a case, you review the police, and then you make a decision whether or not to file or not to file the case. Once it's filed, it's something that in the vertical units, you typically will hold on to that case through the life of the case. And you handle every stage of it through discovery. If it's a felony, you're doing the preliminary hearing, you're doing the trial preparation on it. It takes place with the defense, and also the defense will ask the court for offers as well, because the court is also the other place that offers can be made. And so yeah, that's kind of how that process kind of goes. And yes, we're communicating with the defendant's team pretty much once the case gets filed, because once a defendant comes in for arraignment, they are appointed counsel if they are meet the requirements, or they can hire their own private attorney, or if they so choose, they can represent themselves. And so in most of our cases that we deal with, we have represented counsel that we're dealing with. And for many of us, especially those that are government lawyers as well, we're interacting with the same people time and time again. So we get to know them and how they are and those types of things.
Oh, great. Thanks for that information. I didn't even really know that myself. So, okay. So Justin is someone who is kind of still not really sure if he should go to law school or not. So he wants to know, would you still recommend the practice of law to would-be students? And if so, who would you not recommend go down this path?
Well, I would definitely recommend students, and I talk to students, recommend to them to go into the practice of law. But one of the things I do tell them to do is, if you're in law school, try and get as many experiences as you can, because some of us go into law school and don't know what we want to do coming out the backside. Some people go in with a very specific idea. I mean, there were some of my law school students that were like, I'm going to be an IP lawyer when I get out. I'm going to be business litigation, whatever. Some people had some very, very specific ideas. But the practice of law is very, very rewarding in that, the legal system impacts our lives in every facet. We're a society that's built on laws, and you're invariably going to find a part of the law that interests you, that is something that you find your passion in, and that really gives you that fulfillment from a professional standpoint. And I think the skills as a lawyer allow you to do other things. And let me just give you a couple examples. One of the things that I've done in my community is I had the opportunity to serve on the board of trustees for one of our local nonprofit organizations. And having those legal skills allows me to understand legal liability, analyze documents that come through, analyze legal issues that our board potentially might deal with. The other thing is, last fall, I was elected to my local school board. And I will tell you, as an attorney, and understanding a lot of the different ways that government kind of intersects and how the legal system works, and having some familiarity with those things, because some of that stuff you learn in law school, some of those things you learn just in life, but the legal training that you get allows you to do a lot of things, even if they're not necessarily within the law. And I will tell you that some of my classmates in law school have moved on to different careers. They've found other places for them themselves in terms of what they enjoy, but a lot of what they've learned in law school, they're able to take forward and apply in their life. So who would I not recommend go down this path? Well, if you don't like talking, no, I'm just kidding. It really depends. I mean, because there's lawyers that enjoy that their focus is on writing, other lawyers that focus on, that are in court speaking, like what I do. So it's, if you don't have a passion for the law, if you're not interested in this type of stuff, if you're interested in something else, great. There's a lot of different things that all of us can do in life, and you should really pursue a path if you really feel strongly about it. But law school is an interesting place to be, and I would definitely encourage people that are interested in to look at that. And there are some opportunities when you're in college to take law-related classes. Really kind of depends on your college and university. I will say that I did take a couple at UC Berkeley. I will also tell you that those classes were not ones that gave me an eye towards, I want to go practice law. In fact, they actually pushed me the wrong direction. So I fortunately was able to ignore and block those experiences out of my head when I was applying for law school.
Yeah, just to jump in there, since you're in California, I don't know if Justin is in California or what state he's in, but I mean, I really would warn against going to unaccredited, non-ABA accredited law schools, as well as schools that are typically ranked in the bottom half of the U.S. News and World Report rankings, because I think the job market, especially in California, is very, very saturated. And given how expensive it is, especially even the UC law schools, I mean, if you don't get into a good law school, then I think the chances of that paying off just get lower and lower.
Well, I would simply, I'm going to push back a little bit on that, just simply because there are a lot of different opportunities for folks. Like if you want to go in a direction where you're going to get a federal job or a federal clerkship and working for a judge, or if you want to work in a big firm, yes, you absolutely need to go to a higher ranking accredited law school and get your degree that way, because that's really the only way you're going to get those doors open to you. But I will tell you, there are folks that work in the DA's office in Orange County who did not take that path, because sometimes those doors weren't open to them, right? Just because of their circumstances or their job responsibilities or their life responsibilities, they had to work there. They had to go to only a California accredited law school, but they understood, like, this is the direction I'm going. I'm not going to be able to take my law degree out of state to somewhere else, but my plans are to stay in California. So why would I care? And sometimes those were some of the only doors that were open to them. And sometimes when you're looking at the lawyers that are successful in a DA's office, I would say it's not necessarily the academic reputation that's as important as, let's say, your life experience and understanding what gets people, how do you relate to the average person, right? If you've only had a progression where it's high school, college, law school, and you haven't ever worked, how are you really going to, have that connection? So, it is a risk when you do go to some of those schools, but sometimes that's how the avenue works. And it's a harder path for sure, but it's not one that necessarily closes you out for opportunities. And then the last piece I would say is, if you're a person who at the end of the day is going to be hanging a shingle out on your own and going into your own legal practice, I don't necessarily know that you have to go that direction, right? You can get that degree and do what you feel you can with that law degree, without necessarily having to go some of those paths. And there aren't ABA accredited law schools everywhere in the country. That's just the reality of it. And so, the farming community in Fresno, they only had a couple of small schools out there, and they weren't ABA accredited. So at the time, people got to take advantage of what they have available to them. And yes, it's very difficult getting through bar prep, and I feel really bad for Justin about that. It's unfortunate. So.
Yeah. Well, Justin did mention that he's actually in Virginia, so I'm pretty familiar with that because I lived in Virginia most of the time when I went to Georgetown for law school, and I practiced in Virginia briefly before moving here to North Carolina. So in Virginia, you do have some really great options. If you can get into UVA, then you should go there. And then even George Mason has surprisingly jumped up in the rankings, and that's a place where you could pay in-state tuition, although I'm not sure how much it is for George Mason now. We did have a lot of attorneys that worked at the Fairfax County Public Defender's Office where I interned who graduated from George Mason Law School. So that's a decent law school. I mean, it's not going to put you in the running for big law firm jobs when you're fighting with Ivy League graduates that want to work in DC also, but at least there are some in-state options. Yeah, I would avoid University of Richmond, though. I mean, that's just my bias. And then Washington and Lee is a good school, but I'm not sure if their job placement is as good as UVA. Yeah. So I don't know what schools you were considering, Justin, if you want to tell us. Well, I guess you haven't even taken the LSAT yet, so we got to see what you score on LSAT, right? So let's see. There were some more questions here. Serena is here. Thank you for being here. She says the legal field is competitive and firms let go of people. Do DA's offices also let people go when there's a budget cut?
It's not quite the same because we are government employees and we have certain protections, and there's a whole process. So it's not quite the same. What you do find within any type of government agency is when you're looking at budgets, they're sometimes conservative as it relates to when to hire, right? There's a tendency sometimes of not hiring too much because you don't want to stretch yourself too thin. The last time where we were really facing a situation where we were looking at potential layoffs, that last in, first out type of situation was back during the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And what we ended up doing was we worked out a situation with the county to furlough attorneys, instead of letting people go. So I would say that within government positions, you're less likely to face just people getting pushed out the door because there's a budget problem. I mean, obviously, in some instances when it gets ridiculous and ridiculously hard, such as that time period I just mentioned, they are taking drastic measures. But for the most part, that tends not to be the case. It tends to be a much more stable position. And I would say that one of the things that we're running across is situations where people are saying, well, if I worked in the private sector, I could be making $300,000 and you guys aren't paying anywhere close to that. But we have government benefits and pensions and things like that people sometimes don't necessarily factor into their consideration. And yes, I think in a lot of different situations, working within basically the public sector does qualify for student loan forgiveness programs. But you really need to make sure you check some of those things out with whoever is providing you with the loan to make sure that falls within that for them. But these days, you're seeing more and more of that apply.
Okay, thanks for answering those questions. How about Tran T50? Ever try a murder case? Is it stressful?
Yes, I've tried a couple murder cases. I've also handled some that have resulted in dispositions. And murder cases, yes, they can be very stressful just because the stakes are very high. And obviously, for me, one of the things that you're also interacting a lot with the next of kin. So you have family members that are there, regardless of who it is and what walk of life they came from that was killed. I mean, that's a person who somebody lost. And so those things you carry with you for a long time because those were the important cases. So yes. Yes and yes. that question.
Well, did you ever worry about your own safety though? I mean, you're constantly prosecuting these like gang members, and like you worry about your own safety or your family's safety?
I don't. I know that some of my colleagues have had run-ins where they have been threatened, especially those prosecutors that are in the gang unit. They've gotten threatened. I've also known someone that worked in domestic violence who got threatened because some of the individuals that are doing that type of work or that are being prosecuted, they have sometimes very violent tendencies or inclined to threaten and harm people, which was obviously sometimes the reason why they landed in the legal system in the first place. So yeah, those are sometimes considerations, but those tend to be few and far between. Fortunately, I think as long as you're not doing stupid stuff like disrespecting a gang member's gang in court, stuff that they take personally. I mean, to some extent there's an understanding of you get arrested by the police, prosecutions happen, this is how the system goes. But when you make things personal, people tend to take it personally, and that can be problematic. So, it's wise not to cross that line. And there have been moments where I've gotten heated. I can think of one instance where I put a witness on the witness of an individual I previously prosecuted, and he was testifying not because he wanted to in my case against one of his buddies. And he got really heated. I got really heated. He threw a document at me, and basically the judge told us to back off because it was getting kind of bad. But even that worked out fine, because after the break, he actually apologized, and I apologized back to him. So you just sometimes we let it get to us, and you just got to keep some of that in check and not cross the line where you shouldn't. But that's not to say that there aren't people out there that, regardless of how you handle a case, they might have a problem with you and threaten you, and that's really happened to some of my colleagues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. And then you hear about some federal judges being shot or being stalked also. So
yeah, you do. Scary. But even in those, I mean, it's very, very rare. Statistically speaking, it is a very, very rare things to happen. More often than not, people are upset more at their own attorneys, and they'll go after them. And it's not necessarily they're going after judges or prosecutors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you hear about that attorney in New York City who was stabbed 20 times by his former client? It was a foreclosure case.
At all.
Yeah, pretty awful. It was just in the news. Okay, so we have more questions. Oh, and by the way, Justin says, haha, thank you. He's taking the LSAT in October. So good luck to you. And like I said, stay away from low-ranked law schools, in my opinion. Low-ranked private law schools, not worth your time or money. Yeah. Okay, what about expert witnesses, forensic psychologists? Do you work with any of them? All the time, right?
I don't work with forensic psychologists. Doesn't really come up in terms of the types of cases I handle. In terms of expert witnesses, yeah, I'm dealing with expert witnesses on a daily basis. I mean, when you think about it, law enforcement officers are expert witnesses in their own right, depending on their training and experience. That's what an expert witness means. But yeah, on a drug case, you're invariably dealing with a forensic scientist who did the lab analysis to evaluate the substance. On a DUI case, you're dealing with the same, someone who's actually processing the blood alcohol level. That's all done by a scientist. We have a coroner that will come in and talk about, or a pathologist, forensic pathologist. Kind of depends on which jurisdiction you and how they describe it. Some places it's a medical examiner, but they're coming in and talking about cause of death and those types of things. And so yeah, we're dealing with expert witnesses all the time. Defense is also oftentimes expert witnesses to talk about things. It's not uncommon for us to call medical practitioners. When I was handling child abuse cases, there were certain circumstances where I had very, very young children, infants, toddlers that had suffered severe brain damage, and I couldn't explain that to somebody. I would have to come in and basically talk about those things. And so you'd bring in the treating physicians, you would bring in neurologists, and they would talk about those things. And so one of the fun challenges of the law is you don't necessarily need to know everything about a particular subject matter, but you have to know enough to be able to navigate your way around it and to present that information to a jury. And part of the fun of doing that is you're allowed to be there and be a student. Like, I don't understand. What do you mean by that, doc? Explain that. And so those are always a great opportunity to kind of learn and also kind of help a jury learn, what does this stuff mean. In terms of working with them, the reality of how a lot of the work we do is they're not in-house. We do have certain units that have investigators that are forensic accountants, for example. But for the most part, the rest of us, we're just dealing with whatever agency and whatever people were working at whatever hospital on that particular day and subpoenaing those witnesses and having them come in and testify. Whatever officer was on duty that day, that's the witness you get. So we're not really cherry picking witnesses. We're just dealing with whatever the cards were dealt with. Sometimes the experts are testifying for the first time, and if you know what you're doing, you can help them navigate through their stuff because they're sometimes struggling to figure out, how to answer a question. And I like to tell them, like, look, you know what the answer is. You do this for work on a daily basis. You're just not used to explaining it to people. And my responsibility as a prosecutor is to ask the right question to give you an opportunity to help you explain what it is that you're seeing, what you're experiencing, and how to apply your expertise in your testimony. So that's always been a fun part of the job. And the other piece that I've always enjoyed is cross-examining an expert witness, figuring out why is it that this person's saying this, where is their opinion weak, what are they kind of trying to shade over? Because your expert witnesses that are truly truthful, you'll find that they'll hedge where they're supposed to hedge. You just need to ask the right question because the defense is going to ask the questions that make it look like this is really solid. But you got to know, like, okay, where's the weak underbelly? Where are you actually not so sure? And where are those openings? And if you're what you do, you're able to figure those things out and get them to provide you that information, that concession. That's like, hey, so you're actually not that far away from what my person that I called is saying. Nope, actually, they're right in the ballpark as well. So you just have a slight professional disagreement on that. Yep, that's basically what it comes down to. And then it's a matter of your jury being able to decide, okay, who's in the right here.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great. Okay. And then my friend Eunice is here. She says, how do you take care of your mental well-being? I could imagine dealing with all these high-stress cases could take a toll on you.
They do, for sure. That's something that I think we in my profession don't necessarily recognize as well because we oftentimes suffer that secondary trauma. You think about it in terms of the first responders that are responding to a scene and addressing some of those things. But then we get it in a secondary sense in that we're the ones that are reviewing an autopsy photo or autopsy photos in multiple cases or watching interviews of sexual assault victims, and after a while, some of that really takes a mental toll. And it's important that we have a well-balanced life, that you're able to find things that interest you outside of work, and that we have different career paths within the office. I mean, one of the things that we do as attorneys, and granted, yes, I've been in my assignment for about 9 years, and it's probably time for me to move on to something different. But we do have opportunities to move within the office and have different experiences. And so having the ability to take on different assignments and learn those assignments gives you the ability to go from like, all right, I'm done with this work. It's, I just need to move on and do something different. And so, yeah, that can definitely have that impact on your mental health, but it's important to have those other supports around you, the community that you have, the family that you have, the friends that you have, to help you kind of get through that. And just a recognition, a self-awareness of that, and figuring out what can help you through that. And sometimes for some of us, it's therapy, and others it's a hobby that we love and we enjoy. And for some of the attorneys in this office, because we're in beautiful Orange County, they go surfing in the morning. That's their way of getting themselves in the right mental space before they roll into the office.
And what are your work hours normally like? Do you have to work weekends or do you have to work late a lot?
It really kind of depends on your assignment, number one, and what's going on within that assignment. So typically when you're in trial, it's 24/7, whether or not you're in the office or you're not, because you're constantly thinking about the case. It's just invariably what happens. But there are some assignments where it's basically 8 to 5. You roll in the morning, you handle your cases, and you go home at night. You don't really have to think about it. But some of us in other assignments, it's a little bit different. The one thing that I'll say is in COVID, it really has thrown things up in the air because some of us it's a combination of working from home, managing children, those types of things, also trying to do the job. And so I would say that during the past year, the work hours have become much more fluid. And certainly I've found that to be true myself in terms of when I'm working and finding time on weekends to make up stuff. Whereas during the past year, when I've had to deal with my kids and stuff like that, of trying to navigate some of those things. And so we'll probably get back to some type of routine at some point, but COVID has definitely thrown a curveball towards stuff. The other thing that COVID has done is it's also changed how we do court appearances, because it used to be that we'd have to run around to every single courthouse, especially on Fridays when we have most of our vertical cases being heard for calendar purposes. But now we have the ability to call in to certain courtrooms. And so, I can make a court appearance in person in one location, but then make a virtual appearance or a telephonic appearance in another courthouse, and the judge doesn't blink. The judge is like, oh, that's normal, And 2 years ago, that was not normal. That was, you drive to one courthouse, you try and coordinate with the other person by cell phone. Okay, can you meet me there at 10:30? Great. Okay, so you're at a different courthouse. All right, we're going to get there at 10:30, handle this and whatever. But there's a lot more flexibility now, which has been great.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Huh?
Also good for the environment when you're not driving nearly as much.
Oh yeah, totally. There's a lot of driving involved in Los Angeles, right? Southern Cal. Yeah, because we're doing
County as well. Because we have 5 different courthouses in the county, and they're not next to each other. So there's a little bit of driving involved if you have to run from one end of the county to another.
Oh, okay. That's great. Okay. Wow. We have a lot more questions for you to answer. So, okay. Serena says, what's been your career progression at the DA's office? Have you stayed in the same bureau?
Sure. So I started off my career in the juvenile division. So I was there for a year, and then I did misdemeanors in 2 different courthouses for about 5 years after that. Then I went to what we call felony panel, and that's where we do general felony trials. From there, I went into the domestic violence unit, where I was there for about 3 years. I know the math isn't going to add up, right? Because I have a very poor recollection of exactly when these things happened. And then after that, I've been in the gang unit for the past 9. And along the way, when I was younger, in terms of the misdemeanor assignments, we would also work what we call our felony charging departments, which are the ones that handle felony cases before preliminary hearing, before and up to preliminary hearing. So a lot of jurisdictions do things a little bit differently. You'll have grand jury, but in California, we use grand jury for very limited types of cases. They tend to be our very complex cases, just because we only tend to take those cases to the grand jury. And so everything else is by preliminary hearing. So to quickly explain what that means, it's basically a probable cause hearing where I call on the police officers or the witnesses to testify in front of a judge, and the judge decides whether or not there's sufficient evidence to hold the defendant to answer for trial. And so, during that process, the attorneys need to put on evidence, that type of a thing. And so that's kind of our interaction with felony cases at that stage. And so I had a couple assignments where I did that along the way, in addition to doing misdemeanor trials. And to give you an idea, perhaps even in terms of during the course of my career, I've done about 25 misdemeanor trials, probably 20 to 30 juvenile trials, and 60 felony trials.
Wow, that sounds like so much stress thinking about that. I've had 1 jury trial in my whole career so far, and I almost had another jury trial coming up next month, but the case just settled. So, most of my cases.
When I worked in civil, that was the thing, right? My supervisors had never really gone to trial, and it was a big thing getting ready for a trial. But what you do is when you get into the DA's office and you're doing hearing after hearing every single day, and you're used to putting on evidence, you're just simply adding on more pieces by the time you get to trial, right? Oh, now I have a jury. Great. Okay, that's the one difference. But you get to a point where you don't even blink anymore. It becomes very, very easy to figure out what you're doing, and it becomes less about the routine aspects of trial and putting on evidence, like how do you put on evidence, and it goes to the higher levels of figuring out, well, what's trial strategy? What am I doing? What am I trying to accomplish? Which witnesses do I put on? And I will tell you that my colleagues and I often have different approaches to putting on cases. I had a judge one time tease. I was in chambers with this judge, and defense counsel and I have known each other for a number of years, but we hadn't really done any trials against each other. And he made the comment of, "Oh, you're putting her on, aren't you?" And I looked at him and said, "Why would I put her on?" And he's like, "Because you have to." And I'm like, "No, I don't." And the judge looked at the attorney and said, "Jeremy, you don't understand, Cyril. he puts on cases paper thin. And the idea was like, there's a difference between some people who just put on a very focused case, and you have other attorneys on the other end who feel like, I need to put in everything because my juries expect me to put in everything. So I put in everything, even if it's something that doesn't matter. Like, okay, that's your approach, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But a lot of us take different approaches towards putting on our cases and figuring out what issues we want to highlight. And some of them are our own personalities, how we view cases, what we think is important. But that's kind of the unique aspect of trial work, is that we all kind of do things a little differently. I mean, most of the time, the key witnesses are the key witnesses, but sometimes the other pieces of it, you figure out by your experience in terms of what's important and how you want to put on your case.
Okay, that was very choppy. I'm sorry. I couldn't really hear like half of what you were saying, unfortunately. But okay, well, hopefully everything's okay for you there.
Pay your student loans.
Yeah, student loans. Either your experience or your colleagues' experience.
I'll say that I was very fortunate in terms of that I worked a fair amount in college. I also got out through law school without accruing any student loans. But that is a situation. But yes, it is oftentimes very hard to pay. Okay. I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, your mouth is moving.
I was very fortunate to be in a situation where, when I was working through any student loans at all. So I was one of those.
Yeah, it was like
Let me know what I should
speaking wasn't matching with what was going on the screen. So,
okay.
It's a little out of sync. Yeah.
Do you want
okay.
Me to
So
answer again, then?
Yeah, so we heard you say that you worked through college and then you didn't actually need any loans to get through law school, which is great because once again, both Cyril and I went to law school more than 20 odd years ago. So back then, I'm pretty sure Hastings was probably close to $10,000 a year for in-state, because I specifically remember being mad that they wanted me to pay $18,000 something $100 for out-of-state tuition at Hastings that year. Yeah, which was probably about double what in-state tuition would have been if they had let me pay in-state tuition. So, and back then, when I went to Georgetown was a little over $24,000 a year for a private school. But now, law school is just crazy expensive. So that's why you see so many people with like $200,000 or even $300,000 plus of debt for law school.
Right. Yeah, and that's really unfortunate. And kind of to go back to the earlier question about loan forgiveness programs, that's where those have been vital for people that are interested in going public interest or working for the government. Some of those opportunities, that's the only way that people can even do this type of work, just because it is just completely insane when it comes to the amount of loan debt that they're picking up when they're leaving law school.
Yeah. And okay, so Tony is asking, how do appeals work? Your office doesn't handle appeals, right? Usually it's a different agency or office.
Right. So within the way the state of California works is, so we have county level prosecution, and then if there is an appeal, that's usually handled by the Attorney General's office. The only time our office handles it is if there's a misdemeanor appeal that remains within the Superior Court system. There's kind of a there is a court that kind of reviews some of the stuff, but I don't think they do a lot of those cases. So our attorneys on occasion will go down to the Court of Appeals to argue things, but that tends to be motion work that's generated pre-conviction. But if it's a post-conviction appeal, then it's the type of stuff that the Attorney General's office handles.
Okay, great. Okay, and then Tran T50 has another question. Trying a case is expensive. Do expert witnesses get paid well? And is funding ever an issue? Does the DA or Public Defender's office do those two offices get equal funding?
I don't actually know the answer to the last question in terms of the funding that takes place. I do know that the Public Defender's office, at least in Orange County, gets a pretty good budget to do what they need to do to get their work done. I know that that's not necessarily the same situation in other parts of the United States, but I think in California, we do a fairly good job of funding both sides and ensuring that the Public Defender's office has sufficient resources. Do expert witnesses get paid well? In terms of hiring private expert witnesses, that's mainly something that the defense bar does. Like I was saying before, a lot of the work that we do, you have either government workers that are providing that work. So for example, we have a crime lab that does the lab work, and basically we just send them a subpoena and their people show up. They're paid effectively as government employees doing their government job. And the same is true with the coroners that come in and testify, right? That's just part of their job. There's not extra pay that we're paying them to provide that. And then the doctors that we bring in on cases, as much as they may gripe about the fact that they want expert witness fees, it's like, no, you're the treating physician for this child. I'm dropping a government subpoena on you. You need to show up, and I'm happy to work around your schedule. I get that, you're a surgeon or you're an ER doctor, and your time is important and you need to be helping people, but you also perform a function for the state of California as a witness. And sorry, but that's just how that works. So so that's how I would answer that. There are circumstances where we will need to hire an expert witness. I have not had a lot of circumstances that I can think of where that's been the case, where I've had to go find some expert witness who doesn't know anything about my case to come in and form an opinion about something. But typically it's the defense that will, bring in a professor to talk about, cross-racial identification, or bring in a privately paid expert to attack the work that my forensic scientist has done in terms of their DNA analysis and point out, this is the reason why it wasn't done correctly or whatever. And oftentimes you'll have people that used to work in those government jobs who retire and then decide to go and provide expert witness testimony. So that's what I tend to see. And so I won't really be able to say whether or not they're well compensated. When we ask them, they'll tell us what their hourly rate is. And it certainly strikes me as, I think you're getting paid pretty good for this work. And that's certainly an argument I make to the jury.
Yeah, that's right. Going back to Tran T50's question about the DA's and public defenders' offices, from what I've read in Virginia, it is slightly different, where the public defenders get paid less than people who work for the DA's office, by several $1,000s or so. So I guess it varies from state to state how the legislature decides to fund them.
The question was more in terms of funding. And so I looked at it more from a resource allocation, right? From, do they have enough money to go hire their own experts, that type of stuff. I will tell you, as it relates to pay, that the public defenders in Orange County and the DAs in Orange County get paid the same. And how do I know that? Because we're all part of the same union. And so our union actually consists of all the county attorneys. And so we are all working off the same pay scales. Obviously, it's up to the individual offices to decide, how quickly or not quickly they promote people within their offices. But in terms of compensation, if there was somebody that's in the public defender's office that is at the same level I am, if they're a senior deputy district attorney, I have a general idea of what they're making, because, we might be off by a step or two, but our pay is pretty much equivalent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So we're almost at just about an hour. Are there any other parting thoughts or words of wisdom, words of encouragement you'd like to put out there to the viewers?
Well, first off, Judy, thank you for inviting me. It's nice to see an old friend, even though we're not all that old. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. I've really enjoyed this journey that I've taken into the law. I had the opportunity when I was a teenager. My dad sat me down and said, "Hey, what do you want to do with your life?" And I was like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. I don't really like blood and guts. So I don't want to be a doctor. But I'm like, you know what? The law seems really interesting. And at the time, I didn't know any lawyers. My dad worked for Bank of America, and he worked a lot of litigation type of thing, or did a lot of litigation work. So he actually knew a fair number of lawyers. And so they kind of gave him some ideas as to books that he should pass along to me. And that's really where the interest sparked. Reading a book of lawyer jokes, of all things. And that kind of took off. And from there, it's just one thing led to the next. And every step along this really tremendous journey, I've really enjoyed it. It has been one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. And I really love this work. And I didn't know that I'd be doing prosecution work for this long. When I left my last private firm, one of my coworkers was like, once you get done with, you'll be done with trials in like 3 or 4 years. You can come back and join us and make all the money. I'm like, okay, sure. And at the time, I really didn't know that I'd be basically a career prosecutor, but that's the way my career's worked out. And I'm very happy with the choices that I've made and the people I get to work with. So thank you for this opportunity to share. And that's it.
Great. Okay, well, hope to be in touch again. I was just thinking we haven't seen each other since 2012 when I went to visit Los Angeles and Florida.
That's true.
And,
yes,
and you and I got together.
When we're not on fire out in the state of California.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. And another guest, Tony, is also thanking you and hope you come back on the show again. So if there's some hot button issue you want to talk about for a future show,
let me know. You've got something you want to ask, invite me back on. I'm happy to talk about it. I'll always happy to make myself available to you.
Okay. Thank you. Have a good night. You can stay on, but I'll end the broadcast for now. Okay?
Sounds good. All right.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Good luck, Justin.